Welcome to this battle map presentation on the Battle of Hastings, 14th of October 1066. The aim is to know the events of the Battle of Hastings. Here's something to get us started though. By the time Harold Godwinson and the Saxons arrived in Hastings ready for the battle, why might they not have been in the best shape to win? Have a think about what you might have learnt already. Or if you haven't learnt very much about this, you might want to consider doing my full lesson on this. A link is included in the description if you want to check that out first. Well, you might be aware that this isn't the first battle of 1066, and indeed King Harold had been weakened by two earlier battles, one of which he won, but one of which the Saxons actually lost. That was the Battle of Great Gate Fulford, although it should be said that Harold wasn't actually at that battle. But at Stamford Bridge, despite crushing the Vikings there, Harold lost 5,000 of his best soldiers. Not only that, he found himself at exactly the wrong end of the country for when the Norman invasion arrived. So we're going to consider first of all, before we have a look at the battle map, the circumstances surrounding the weeks leading up to the Battle of Hastings and why that weakened Harold. After that we'll have a look at the battle itself and we'll conclude with just a few thoughts about why William won. Remember that in January of 1066 Edward the Confessor had died and Harold Godwinson had been made King of England. However, Harold Hardrada and William of Normandy did not agree. So, our first major event of 1066, aside from Harold becoming king, was Harold Hardrada's invasion of northern England. The Vikings sailed up the east coast, they burnt down Scarborough, and then sailed up the Humber estuary and into the River Ouse, heading for York. There, just outside the gates of York, at the Battle of Gate Fulford, the Vikings won a victory over Edwin and Morcar, two English earls who had tried to defend York from the Viking invasion. However, this had delayed somewhat the Viking advance through Yorkshire, and it had given Harold Godwinson time to muster an army of his own and march the 180 miles north to Yorkshire. The thing is, Harold Godwinson had been defending the south coast against an expected Norman invasion by William of Normandy. So he had taken a big gamble here. But Hardrada was already on English shores. He was the bigger and more immediate threat, and so Godwinson needed to deal with that. And deal with it he did. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the Saxons won a crushing victory over the Vikings. The Vikings had arrived in 300 ships, and they left in only 24. Such were the extent of their losses. But at that point, just a few days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, with Harold Hardrada no longer a threat, and in fact in his grave, William of Normandy set sail for England. He arrived at Pevensey on the south coast on the 28th of September, and apparently fell over onto his face the moment that he left the boat. Rather than it being a bad omen, he grasped the sand and said to his followers, "Look how keen I am to seize this land of England." Nicely styled out there. What he was amazed by, though, was the lack of English resistance. He could not understand why Harold Godwinson's feared and thanes were elsewhere. Little did he know of the battles in the north. So Harold and his retinue had to chase south again, at which point they met. William and Harold met at the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October. And of course, that was a historic Norman victory. What we're going to be doing next is we're going to be looking at a battle map presentation of the Battle of Hastings itself. This is where I take a very badly drawn Microsoft Paint background and I superimpose some symbols representing the soldiers on top and crudely animate it. What I am told though is that this is quite a clear way of communicating the main features of the battle. So your task is to watch this, to make any notes that you feel are appropriate, and then afterwards we're going to be asking the question, why did William end up winning? Let's first consider the battlefield at Hastings. The dominant feature of this battlefield was Senlac Hill. This was a natural defensive position, flanked with woodland on each side that cavalry would struggle to penetrate. Beyond that was the main road to London. Underneath the hill, well, really, William was going to be hemmed in. His choice was either to retreat to his boats, most of which he'd either sent away or destroyed so that his men had no line of retreat, or a marsh where they might get bogged down quite literally. So Harold had chosen a good location, but he had been hasty. As he deployed his shield wall at the top of the hill, he was using a very traditional defensive tactic, but he had rushed into it. He could have waited longer and gathered more men, but he had remembered the success of achieving surprise at the Battle of Stamford Bridge a few weeks earlier and wanted to emulate that success. Unfortunately for him, the Normans were tipped off and they were ready. The shield wall was a traditional defensive formation consisting of overlapping shields with swords and spears and axes thrust through it. The front line was made up of trained housecarls and thanes. This was the bulk and most well-trained element of Harold's army. Commanders on the wings were Leofwine and Geirf. These commanders on the flanks would keep discipline amongst the troops. King Harold would fight in the middle. And here Harold was making another gamble. He knew that fighting amongst his men put him in danger, but that only increased their morale and their will to fight. But one potentially dangerous move about this, other than to life and limb, was that he was unable to communicate effectively and quickly with Geirf and Leofwine. Should anything happen to them, then the discipline on the flanks would be easily damaged. Making up the second line were the feared. Less well-trained, less well-equipped, and less experienced soldiers, who nevertheless could fill any gaps that formed in the shield wall and help support the thanes and housecarls at the front. So Harold's strategy was simple. Stand at the top of a hill, stay in formation, and invite the Normans to try and punch through them. Let's consider the Norman deployment now. Duke William positioned his soldiers in 3 rows. The first row were his archers. The second row were his infantry, armed with swords, spears, shields, and in mail armour. And the third row were the cavalry, which William had brought across the channel at such challenge and great risk. So William had a more modern and more flexible army, but he still needed to break through the shield wall atop the hill. At this stage, William had to make the first move. He moved his archers forward, and they loosed arrows towards the shield wall. Most of the arrows harmlessly hit or bounced off the Saxon shields, or embedded themselves in the side of the hill, or sailed equally harmlessly over the Saxon heads. We can imagine the taunting that the Saxons gave them now. Shouts of "Oot, oot, oot," meaning out in Old English, or perhaps "Holy Cross," which was the battle cry of King Harold, named after the monastery that he had established. Whatever way, William's archers had failed to soften up their English targets. So William readied a massive charge by his infantry next. As they laboured up the hill with their shields, their armour and their swords, they clashed with the shield wall, but again they could not break through. Fierce fighting ensued until eventually the Normans had to retreat. More taunting from the English, no doubt, but let's not kid ourselves, some English had been killed in this encounter too. Thirdly, William sent forward his cavalry. Although the most powerful soldiers that he had, heavily armed with shields, swords and lances, the horses could not break through the shield wall. The shield wall might as well have been a stone wall for all the horses knew, and it was covered in gleaming armour and gleaming sharp spears and spikes. Therefore the horses often shied away, and it was not unknown for the great Dane axes wielded by the housecarls to take off a horse's head with one fell swoop. Again, William's men had to retire. So, during this encounter, it is worth pointing out that Saxon discipline had begun to break down. At some point, Geirf and Leofwine had both been either killed or wounded, but certainly they were unable to command their wings. Not only that, but other Saxons had been killed, and their places had to be taken by the feared. The shield wall still held, but it was not as strong and as disciplined as it had been before. William, having little other option, threw his infantry back against the shield wall. Again, a huge clash, more very physical fighting, but they were unable to break through. At this point, a potentially deadly rumour spread amongst the English and the Normans alike. The rumour spread that Duke William was dead. On William's left, the Bretons began to panic and fled towards the marshes. Had Leofwine been there to control his men, he may well have been able to countermand what happened next, but he was not there, and he was probably dead. But the indisciplined shield wall, thinking that this was their moment, chased the Normans down the hill. At this stage, King Harold might have been able to cause a mass panic if he committed the rest of his army to a general charge down the hill while the Normans were so disrupted. But uncharacteristically cautiously, perhaps knowing that he had already lost so many good warriors at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold decided to stay put. Those Saxons that had left the security of the shield wall were cut down. Duke William lifted his helmet, showed his face, and reassured his soldiers that he was still there. He said, "I live, and with God's help we'll conquer still. only he had a French accent and probably didn't speak in English. As the Norman cavalry swept round the Saxons who had left the shield wall, it showed the flexibility and mobility and power of these cavalry soldiers, and the surrounded Saxons were wiped out. This gave William an idea, though. If those Saxons had been tempted to leave the safety of the shield wall, perhaps others would be tempted too. Cue the tactic of feigned retreats. William got his soldiers to pretend that they were running away, hoping to tempt the English off the top of the hill. And this often worked, which gave William the opportunity to get his men to turn around, pin the Saxons who had left the shield wall down, and use his cavalry to again surround and defeat them. He did this again and again and again until the Saxon shield wall was getting exhausted and perilously thin. It was at this stage that King Harold was likely fighting in the front lines himself, the shield wall beginning to break. So, recognising that the shield wall had actually become weakened, William brought his archers forward again. They shot high and they shot low, and this did do damage. One arrow, it is supposed, if we believe a couple of the sources at least, struck Harold in the eye, either killing him or wounding him sufficiently that the Normans were able to move in for the kill. Other sources suggest that Harold was cut down by knights. Whatever happened, King Harold was dead. William sent in the rest of his troops to swamp the remaining English, and those that had not sworn blood oaths to stay put and fight to the death fled and melted away. The point was, the English army was utterly defeated by this point, and in any case, their cause for fighting, their king, was dead. And without a king to fight for, there was nothing left to fight for. So was Duke William now King William the Conqueror? Not quite. He would still need to secure his new conquest, but this was a significant step along the way. So Duke William won, and he became King of England. Soon. Let's conclude by giving some consideration as to why William won. Factors for Norman success. Firstly, there's Harold's leadership. Harold was a good leader, but his decision to command his army in the thick of it, actually in the fighting, meant that he couldn't actually command his army in a flexible way like William did. Then there's Harold's preparation and organisation. He had rushed to Hastings to confront William because Harold had realised that it was surprise that was almost decisive at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and he wanted to replicate that success. But instead, he hadn't prepared properly and had not gathered enough men. His army and their troops were of high quality at times, but because he had lost so many well-trained men at Stamford Bridge, he had to rely on only partially trained and partially equipped feared soldiers, as well as his trained housecarls and thanes. His tactics could also be called into question. The shield wall tactic was tried and tested. It was also incredibly simple to understand for the inexperienced troops in Harold's ranks. However, it was no match for the flexible tactics that William employed. William's leadership during the battle was also inspiring. He also served in the front lines like Harold, but being mounted on a horse, he was able to better communicate with his commanders and coordinate the battle. His preparation and organisation had been phenomenal as well. He'd been able to build a fleet and unload even horses onto the English shores so that he could bring his powerful cavalry with him. This is shown actually in the extract for the Bayeux Tapestry you can see on this screen. Also, William's army and their weapons were the most modern available. Although they were not new inventions as such, the idea of using archers, cavalry and infantry in combinations was really new. And that meant that his tactics were also very good. Remember that as well as using his troops in combinations, he used feigned or fake retreats in order to tempt the Saxons from the top of the hill, surround them and kill them. But let's not forget about chance and luck. It was luck that the wind changed when it did, allowing William to arrive in the south of England. It was luck that meant that when he did so, Harold was not there. And it was bad luck on the part of the Saxons that meant that they had to face two invasions at two ends of the country in very quick succession. And it was definitely bad luck for Harold, that he allegedly got struck in the eye by an arrow. If you want to find out a bit more detail about these different factors, though, check out the full lesson that I've prepared on the Battle of Hastings. A video about that lesson can be found in a link on the description, so click on that and you'll get a more detailed view of the Battle of Hastings overall. But on that note, that is the end of this battle map presentation. I'll say thanks very much for watching. I hope it's been useful, and if it has been, press the like button and subscribe to the channel too. Thank you and goodbye.